Welcome back to our very special and extremely encouraging video series. In the last video, we talked about the disastrous experiment that was Prohibition and the tyrannically overpowered National Firearms Act, which set the ATF on a crash course with radical top-down authoritarianism. Now, at this point in the series, one question that you are probably asking is, how did we go as a country from completely unrestricted firearm availability and mail-order rifles in the 1920s to a government proposal to confiscate all semi-automatic weapons and all handguns? Why was there this craze for centralized government power in the 1930s? It seems just very much out of step with the immediate preceding American time frame and even the American values that we claim to hold to today. Well, at the time, kind of everybody was doing it. All the cool European countries that were advanced and modern and industrialized and scientifically organized were handing down not just new laws and prohibitions, but very specific dictates on how things should be run. Busting the big businessmen who might object, and also disarming the little guys, just in case they might stand in the way. Notable examples of this are obviously Russia, where we have Soviet commissars disarming the people after the Russian Revolution, and then there's also that famous 1928 German Weapons Act, which imposed strict permits and record keeping for the few who were allowed to keep these small arms. This was a trend to diminish the citizens and elevate the state. The idea being that we would get onto this new utopic planned economy track. Somehow the state was going to use its omniscience to know exactly what people should be doing, and then its omnipotence to get them to do them, and then its benevolence would shine forth. Even gentle satirists like P.G. Wodehouse were making fun of how widely these ideas were being discussed. The totalitarians wanted a total reorganization of society to benefit those groups of people that would be utterly devastated by the reorganization of society.
The whole of Wales and Scotland will be given over to the production of the potato.
Nothing but potatoes?
Nothing but potatoes. Just as Gloucestershire will be entirely laid down to turnips and Wiltshire to beans. Rationalisation is the order of the day. Warwickshire will manufacture umbrellas and shooting sticks, and Norfolk, because of its distinctive topography, motor cars.
I don't quite see that, Spode.
It has all been scientifically worked out, I assure you.
And America was full of amateur dictators who were doing the exact same thing. Remember that the 1934 Firearms Act was written by Homer Cummings. As FDR's Attorney General, he rammed through a lot of New Deal restructuring. The New Deal agenda did things like confiscate privately owned gold, ratchet up a bunch of new taxes, use National Industrial Recovery Act and Agricultural Adjustment Acts and various other things to take massive control over private businesses and farms. They used public works projects to seize land from sharecroppers, and they hugely bulked up the FBI. The National Firearms Act actually makes a lot more sense when you realize that FDR's ultimate plan was to dissolve all local law enforcement. All municipal police officers, sheriffs, deputies, state inspectors would all be done away with and be replaced by monolithic federal law enforcement agencies. And if you would like to know more about how bad things were and how much worse things could have gotten, you should read The New Deal, or Raw Deal, which is by Buttran Folsom Jr. Unfortunately for FDR, and fortunately for us, there was a lot of pushback. The NFA did get neutered, and the Supreme Court threw out a whole bunch of the New Deal statutes. And then when Homer Cummings wrote new legislation that would have allowed FDR to pack the court with a whole bunch of brand new Supreme Court justices, Congress did not pass it. Despite FDR using Cummings and his Treasury Secretary Morgenthau to sick the DOJ and the IRS attack dogs on various political opponents, I think this might have been something that FDR invented. I think he was the first to really do this. Despite all of this pressure, he was not able to roll out his entire authoritarian vision, fortunately. But unfortunately, a lot of it did stick. Like we said in the last episode, an overarching idea, like Prohibition, can fail, but the idea can still be baked into certain pieces of legislation and certain departments. Ideas like solving social problems by government expansion, addressing individual crimes with wide sweeping collective restrictions, the idea that power must be centralized to be effective. These ideas are deep in the NFA and ATF's DNA. Their framework assumes that they are operating in a world where all of FDR's planned economy came about, not the world that we actually live in. Culturally, we actually took a big step away from FDR's world during World War II. Reality forced us to do that. The Allied nations had to pull back from a lot of these totalitarian moves and theories because they were so utterly dependent upon the civilian population for the sale of war bonds, the work in the factories, and of course, the going to actually do the fighting of the other nations that had a totalitarian bent.
On battlefields all over the world, American soldiers fighting to determine this nation's destiny.
So, nations that had been flirting with mass disarmament suddenly found themselves handing out Sten guns to anybody who was either too old or too young to join the actual military, because the citizenry had become the home guard, the bulwark, the core, the foundation, the trusted remnant. And after the war, all those cool modern American authorities who had been pro-eugenics and pro-positive law had to walk all of that back and dust off their old natural law books in order to prosecute the Nuremberg trials. Very embarrassing stuff for them. And then the regular Americans who had been fighting overseas, well, they came back with a much greater resolve and appreciation for liberty. The 1940s, believe it or not, did bring a bit of sanity to the United States in certain ways. Obviously, the war was incredibly destructive and it was expensive, and it certainly did not result in a smaller or humbler American government. But American citizens themselves were sobered and in some ways more mature. The nonsense of the Roaring '20s was gone, so was the despair of the Depression. American citizens had pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, built an industrial manufacturing powerhouse like the world had never seen, prosecuted a multi-front war on multiple continents while fully supplying a number of allies, and we still came out on top. Today, there is a tendency to view World War II as America's founding myth, and this is when America really came into her own. But this is not the case. American citizens standing up for and fighting for Christian principles and defining freedom in defense of others using those principles is something that our nation has been doing for some time. Our true founding was in 1776, and even that war for American independence was built on top of a considerable track record of economic development and charity and defense of the weak on Christian foundations. The maturity that came out of World War II was more of a return to past principles than a fresh start. I'll give you an example. In 1946, American veterans fought the Battle of Athens right here in Tennessee. There was a corrupt sheriff stealing ballot boxes, and a bunch of recently returned GIs armed up and laid siege to his jail and his deputies until those ballots could be recovered. Things actually escalated to the point of a real gun battle and also the dynamiting of a few deputies' cars. But there were no fatalities, and I just don't think this would have happened a decade earlier. Not the corruption. Obviously, the corruption was totally there. FDR's guys had built a very powerful set of political machines all across the country, and the election fraud in McMinn County was nothing compared to stuff that was going on in Tammany Hall in Missouri in the 1934 election. That was like legendary stuff. But the resistance is the interesting bit, where we see these guys boldly and carefully standing up, using a force of arms to restrain a corrupt official and bring his goons to face the rule of law. That was something that was not happening in the 30s. I think that there was a massive shift in thinking about principles. And you even see it, just for a moment, just a tiny moment inside of the ATF. Because also in the late 40s, the War Department is selling tons of military surplus directly back to the private American people. Trucks and tanks and planes, and of course, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of guns. And the M1 carbine is an issue because the definition of a short barrel rifle in the NFA is any barrel shorter than 18 inches. And some of the M1 carbines had a 17 3/4 inch barrel. To the government's credit, when they realized their mistake, they did not immediately go around rounding up all the citizens. They actually changed the NFA wording to make the SBR limit 16 inches instead of just handing out mass felonies. I mean, obviously it would have been nice to just delete the whole concept of an SBR, but still good to see them tweak it. I do think, though, that this is kind of the last time that we see this kind of helpful analysis at the ATF. By the 1950s, the ATF is collecting billions of dollars in alcohol taxes, and they're doing really important work like designing the new rules for wine labels. They're very focused on alcohol, but that stuff is just kind of boring. And the sugar prices have risen, and so a lot of the old bootleggers are just completely out of business. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff for them to do until around 1968, when the new Gun Control Act was passed, and the alcohol tax unit was renamed the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division. The Gun Control Act puts a lot of new regulations on the books. Mail order sales were banned because JFK was killed by a mail order rifle, almost certainly. There was also a bunch of import restrictions, the requirement for serial numbers on firearms for the first times, also a bunch of stuff about prohibited persons and felons, and new FFL rules. It was a very wide-ranging bill, and it gave them so much to do that by 1972, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division finally became their own independent bureau. They were still under the Treasury Department, but now they are the BATF, and they have a new director, Rex Davis, who pivoted them away from alcohol taxes towards gun control as their primary focus. You know, there was a lot of crime in the 1960s, but the ATF very quickly set a pattern of going after collectors, people who make paperwork mistakes, the low-hanging fruit, not the violent criminals. And the NRA is back in the story now, digging up lots of examples of misuse and actual abuse. By 1979, Congress had opened up a bipartisan investigation of the ATF, and the findings were pretty brutal. They spent a couple of years of hearings, talking to witnesses, getting the details, and it turns out that the ATF had been hassling regular gun owners as if they were FFLs. You would have all the downsides, but none of the upsides of actually being a dealer. That meant the ATF could inspect homes without warrants. That meant they could bust just regular gun owners for not keeping the kind of records that only dealers were required to keep, including all ammo sales. It also meant that they could confiscate firearms if they, the ATF, thought that a gun owner might violate the Gun Control Act in the future. Now, when the members of Congress who were in those committees heard this witness testimony, they were actually, to their credit, appalled. They issued the 1982 Congressional Report on Gross Negligence, and I'm going to link to it in the video because it is pretty good reading. I'll give you a couple of nice quotes. They start off by saying, based on these hearings, it is apparent that the enforcement tactics made possible by current federal firearm laws are constitutionally, legally, and practically reprehensible. As they gathered more and more data, they said approximately 75% of BATF gun prosecutions were aimed at ordinary citizens who had neither criminal intent nor knowledge, but were enticed by agents into unknowing technical violations. The BATF conceded that, in fact, only 9.8% of their firearm arrests were brought on felons in illicit possession charges. This focus on individual citizens is a problem that the committee noted several times, but also they found that there was a focus on not just private citizens, but private citizens that had more expensive firearms. In the months following the announcement of their new priorities, the percentage of gun prosecutions aimed at felons had in fact fallen by 1/3, and the value of confiscated guns had risen. All of this indicates that the Bureau's vague claims of focus upon gun-using criminals and recent reforms are empty words. There is a huge amount of strong language in here that I think is really, really interesting. The final report ends with this banger right here. In light of this evidence, reform of federal firearm laws is necessary to protect the most vital rights of American citizens. Very strong words from that particular group of lawmakers. And the reform of firearm law did arrive. It passed in 1986. The Firearm Owner Protection Act addressed, I would say, most of the issues that were uncovered in this congressional investigation. So no more treating gun owners as dealers, no more warrantless searches, no more preemptive confiscation, and then for actual FFLs, no more tracking ammo sales like guns. And it also allowed gun dealers to sell guns at temporary locations like gun shows. Unfortunately, there was a compromise. The Democrats agreed that the ATF was out of line, but they wanted a compromise, and so they added to FOPA the Hughes Amendment, which, as you probably know, added some new restrictions on machine guns and suppressor parts. Now, in the gun community, on YouTube and Instagram and other places, you have probably noticed that Ronald Reagan gets all of the blame for the Hughes Amendment, but I think that is unfair. He signed the Firearm Owners Protection Law into effect, including the amendment. Presidents cannot veto an amendment to a law, and the Hughes Amendment did not pass on its own. I think that Reagan was actually more hardcore in what he desired to do than the people who proposed the compromise bill in the House. In fact, he actually wanted to abolish the ATF and hand its duties over to the FBI or the Secret Service. There were a couple of different theories out there. But there was a guy who objected. His name was Neil Knox, and I will talk about him in a second. His idea was that it would be better for American freedoms if we actually kept some of these departments small and isolated, firewalled from each other. It would be better for accountability, and we will talk more about this probably in episode 3 of this trilogy series. It's almost certainly not going to get any more episodes. Yes. Neil Knox was the head of NRA-ILA, which is their lobbying arm, and he was instrumental in digging up all the dirt on the ATF. He was the guy that got the ball rolling on those congressional investigations, and he spearheaded the Firearm Owners Protection Act, and I'm confident fought against the Hughes Amendment. I believe that we would be in much, much worse shape without his efforts, and he made a fantastic point throughout all of this. The issue is not the people at the ATF. It's not like this bureau attracts the very worst law enforcement officers in the entire country. It is that the laws that they enforce are so bad, so authoritarian, written in such terrible ways that nobody could enforce them in non-tyrannical ways. And I kind of agree with that assessment, which is why I've spent so long talking about the NFA and prohibitions and all the assumptions that this bureau is built on. I'm going to link to an article written by Neil Knox's son that will flesh out this idea some more. When he testified for Congress in 1979, he said this: "The BATF has become a rogue agency, one which has gone completely outside the limitations of statute, regulations, or lawful authority." The problem is that even though the BATF had gone outside the limits of its authority and the law and the Constitution, I believe that it was still running on the tracks laid down by its founders. I think the administration of the BATF still thought that they were very much on track. Yes, in the late 80s, the ATF was constrained in some ways. Thanks to the efforts of Neil Knox and others, the ATF was admonished severely. I want to reread that quote again. "The enforcement tactics are constitutionally, legally, and practically reprehensible." Like that's pretty strong admonishment. The agency was diminished and it was hemmed in by better laws. This was supposed to be a course correction, but we can see that the ATF did not really change course. I believe that they went a little bit more rogue, actually, searching for an adversary to prove their worth, demonstrate their power, looking for a big scoop, something that was a really big deal, something that they could use to prove their value as a bureau. And obviously that took them to backwoods Idaho and a slightly odd religious homeschool family living in a cabin in the woods. That's right, we're talking about the Ruby Ridge stuff. Now, technically, the government began investigating Randy Weaver in 1984 because of a land dispute with a neighbor. And the blame for this one cannot rest all on the ATF, as you'll see in a minute. But they do kick things off. At first, it's a very complicated story. In 1990, a complex web of confidential informants working undercover for the ATF got Randy Weaver to sell some sawed-off shotguns to other confidential informants working undercover for the ATF. And then some undercover ATF agents ambushed Weaver. They were posing as a stranded family on the side of a snowy road, and they arrested him and his wife and threatened him with jail time and fines and felonies and the loss of his home, unless he could also become an undercover ATF informant and infiltrate a white supremacist group that was operating nearby. Now, this is entrapment. I'm not going to say it was alleged entrapment, because later court cases found that it was indeed entrapment and all the weapon charges were dropped. But at the time, I think Randy Weaver made the right call. When law enforcement officers frame you so that they can force you to help catch other guys, I think it is reasonable to assume that they're going to frame the other guys too. And he said, no dice, I'm not going to turn snitch. And to make matters even more ridiculous, 5 of the 6 leaders of this white supremacist group were later revealed to be undercover dudes from other law enforcement agencies, allegedly. This part is alleged, but I find it 98% believable that the ATF would spend months trying to trick a guy to infiltrate a group that was already being run by their colleagues. But regardless of what the ATF actually knew, it was obvious that they began to give very special attention to Randy Weaver. They were offended by his refusal to turn snitch, and they handed his case over to the U.S. Marshals, and they kept taking him to court. In 1991, there was a mix-up about the court date, which was later found to be kind of deliberate on the part of the prosecutors and the judge, and a warrant was issued for Randy Weaver's arrest because of his failure to appear. The Marshal Service, for some reason, declared this to be a major case, and they brought in the experts. Psychological profiles were developed on the family. By August of 1992, there'd been like 24 surveillance missions on the mountain, months of missions, helicopter flyovers, airplane reconnaissance, hundreds of thousands of dollars of solar-powered cameras had been installed. There were recon teams out there. When stuff started to get hairy, there were 6 deputy marshals camped out on the mountain. Just a huge amount of time and energy had gone into this thing, and now they have to show a return on investment. There is this sunk cost fallacy that the feds are falling into despite having basically unlimited budgets. On August 21st of 1992, 3 deputy U.S. Marshals were on a recon mission, and they got a little bit too close to the cabin. Randy Weaver, his son Sammy Weaver, and their friend Kevin Harris went out to see why the dogs were barking. The feds fired first, killing a dog. Kevin Harris fired back, killing a guy in full camo. Sammy Weaver was shot in the back and killed while he was retreating. This was only the beginning of the siege, and now the FBI got involved. They flew their entire HRT team out immediately, and while they were in the air, they drafted some new rules of engagement that would allow for deadly force without verbal warnings or the justification of defense. The next day, FBI HRT sniper Lon Haruchi shot Randy Weaver in the arm when he went out to bury his son, and then shot his wife Vicky in the head when she opened the door so that Randy and their surviving kids could flee back into the house. Kevin Harris was also injured by this bullet. You might be asking yourself, how did the ATF, the FBI, and the Marshal Service managed to get their most unscrupulous, careless, most trigger-happy, bloodthirsty agents all together in one spot on that little hill in Idaho so fast? And the sad answer is they didn't. I don't think they got the worst agents. I think they got regular guys, but they set up the situation in such a way that this conflict was inevitable. The rules of engagement were virtually shoot on sight, which is very, very different from the FBI's normal rules of engagement. A deviation from the standard ROE is a very big deal, and it would have been taken very seriously by the snipers. These guys probably did not know very much about the case or any of the particulars. And one of the beauties of interagency operations like this is poor communication. You know, you can keep people pretty much in the dark based on your need to hide your confidential informants and other secret information, but you can kind of hint at anything. And you have tons of evidence. None of it means anything in court, but you do have tons of it. So from the agent's perspective, you've got this guy who is apparently a big enough deal to merit a shoot-on-sight order. You hear that he's robbed banks. You hear that he's selling illegal firearms. You hear that he's murdered a U.S. Marshal and a whole bunch of other things that were later completely and utterly debunked in court. You are shown months worth of surveillance photos and reports and even military aerial reconnaissance from the Defense Mapping Agency. Obviously, this thing is a huge deal. And then even after he's shot, he simply refuses to surrender. So why on earth would this guy refuse to surrender? Obviously, this is an even bigger deal than you thought, and you have to keep up that siege. But now, I want you to think about the situation from Randy Weaver's perspective, because if you're Randy Weaver, you know for a fact that you are being framed. You know for a fact that they monkeyed with the court dates. You know for a fact that guys in camouflage opened fire on your son without any ID or warning, and they killed him while he was retreating. You know for a fact that they shot your wife in the head while she was holding a baby. You know for a fact that you cannot trust them when they tell you to surrender. Those are the facts that Randy Weaver had, and they held up in court a lot better than the things that the federal agents had heard. In many ways, this entire situation is a perfect microcosm of everything that we've been talking about in this video series. The ATF is set up based on a bunch of assumptions, and so its agents are going to act in a certain way. The laws that they try to enforce and the way that they fight evidence is almost set in stone. In order to stay on these tracks, they develop confidential informants to find or occasionally create a certain type of gun crime. And then the Ruby Ridge siege was set up a certain way. And based on the accusations and the assumptions and the secret informants and the expensive Marshal surveillance, there was just going to be a collision of lethal force. It was almost unavoidable. Everything that happened ratcheted the tension and the importance of the case up. And there was literally no mechanism in place for the system to de-escalate. The siege did not end until a civilian negotiator named Bo Gritz volunteered to go up and talk to Randy Weaver in person. Kevin Harris needed emergency medical treatment by that point and was helicoptered out. Randy and his family surrendered the next day. Eventually, everything went to court. And interestingly, the counsel for the defense produced no evidence and produced no witnesses. All they did was point out that the prosecution had failed to make a criminal case against Randy Weaver, and the jury agreed. Randy Weaver was found not guilty on all the charges except the original failure to appear, which is fair. He spent 18 months on the mountain not going to court, so he got a fine and a bit of jail time. Kevin Harris was found to have acted in self-defense, and the judge over the case, a federal judge named Edward Loge, found that the DOJ and FBI had been concealing evidence and, this is a quote, showed a callous disregard for the rights of the defendants and the interests of justice. Randy Weaver sued the government and settled out of court for $100,000 for himself and $1 million each for his 3 surviving daughters. However, the government refused to admit any wrongdoing in the settlement. Now, there was a Justice Department internal investigation that wrote a 542-page report detailing federal misconduct and cover-ups in the case, and it suggested, criminal charges against multiple FBI officials. Michael Cahoe, who was the former chief of the Violent Crime Section, he did serve 18 months for destroying some evidence, but that was just, I believe, a single after-action report. Despite all the evidence in the case, pretty much anybody that's connected to the federal government just resists any kind of apology or consequences, and oftentimes they go the other way. So in 1996, the U.S. Marshal Service Director handed out medals to the 5 deputy sheriffs who were on the Hill when the shootout was initiated. They were given the highest award for valor, merited, and the speech, I'll quote from it. They were thanked for their exceptional courage, their sound judgment in the face of attack, and their high degree of professional competence during the incident. In 1997, when the sniper Lon Haruchi was indicted for manslaughter by the Boundary County in Idaho, the trial was moved to federal court very quickly and then dismissed even more quickly on the grounds of sovereign immunity, largely thanks to the efforts of William Barr. He was a federal guy, later on became Trump's attorney general. So it just seems like all parties involved have a very bad attitude about the backlash and kind of resent being investigated in the first place. Particularly, if you remember that in 1993, the ATF also orchestrated the even more disastrous Waco siege. Now, there are some obvious parallels with the Ruby Ridge siege. The Branch Davidians are also some religious homeschool families, but they're not living in the middle of nowhere. David Koresh is actually a pretty high-profile dude, and there's a lot more people living in the compound. I think about 120 when everything kicks off. However, like the Ruby Ridge tragedy, things start earlier. Because David Koresh is this sort of higher-profile religious weirdo, there are a number of hit pieces written about him in various print outlets, and that causes investigations to begin. Child Protective Services investigated the compound in 1992, but didn't find any evidence to justify removing children. But once the media starts painting him as this kook, all sorts of new allegations just sort of magically pop up. The UPS delivery man contacted the authorities to let him know that he was delivering a lot of guns and ammo to the compound, which started an investigation. But you gotta remember, the Branch Davidians had an FFL, and they were regular sellers at gun shows. This was a part of their actual business. They were just normal gun dealers. And David Koresh actually invited the ATF to come audit the guns, which they are allowed to do without a warrant, because that's how the FFLs work. But, you know, the ATF declined, despite being extremely suspicious of some of the firearm-related stuff that these folks were getting up to, and they started to build a case against them. Not based on a failed FFL audit or anything, but just, well, first it was just unsubstantiated rumors that people had heard fully automatic machine gun fire in Texas. As somebody who has lived in Texas, I do think that might have been believable. Then there was just a whole bunch more hearsay and some confused reports. I'm gonna link to Dave Kopel's website because he has a lot of research on the subject and explain why the evidence and the warrants and everything related to these things were kind of hinky, and the raid was a bad call. But eventually the ATF had a big enough stack of documents that they were able to get a search warrant for the compound and an arrest warrant for one guy, David Koresh. So they obviously planned a massive shock and awe raid to bust in and just see if any of those 120 legal guns were being made into machine guns, or if any of those legal inert grenades were being reactivated. Now, another major difference between the Waco scenario and the Ruby Ridge one is that David Koresh was well known to all of his neighbors to be a pretty friendly, outgoing guy who was regularly out of the compound, jogging, doing stuff in town. It would have been way easier to arrest this guy than Randy Weaver. Also, undercover ATF agents had talked to him and other Branch Davidians at gun shows, and they'd even gotten an undercover guy into the compound. So they knew that there were over 100 people in there, including women and kids. And there never should have been a raid. But, of course, there had to be a raid The ATF's PR director had already told reporters to be ready for one. And so, since they needed a big win for a lot of reasons, on the morning of February 28th, 1993, they started to move on the compound. Now, the mailman blew their cover, and the ATF knew that their cover was blown, but they stormed the building anyway, and they completely botched it. It was a 2.5-hour gunfight that only ended when the ATF ran out of ammo and had to retreat. 4 ATF agents were killed, 6 Branch Davidians. Both sides claimed that the other had fired first. It was at this point that the FBI took over the operation, just like at Ruby Ridge, and it became a long and grueling siege. 51 days, so much longer than the one in Idaho. And there was also a massive escalation in force. Bill Clinton had just taken office, and he authorized the use of U.S. Army equipment and personnel, which means that the FBI could requisition Bradley fighting vehicles and even a couple of M1 Abrams tanks from Fort Hood. They used these military vehicles to destroy the outbuildings.
I heard some crunching or something. I looked out the window and I see one of your tanks ran over the guard shack. I thought that was pretty cute.
Crush the privately owned cars of the Branch Davidians, who, by the way, not part of the search warrant or the arrest warrant, just to demoralize them. And then they cut off the power and the water, and they played incredibly loud music and also the sounds of animals being tortured, just to disturb people. And then at night, they would shine searchlights into the windows to stop people from sleeping. And they made regular passes with helicopter gunships and basically did everything in their power to cause discomfort and fear in their own citizens, many of whom were, again, women and children under no charges whatsoever. They even brought in good old Lon Haruchi to occupy a sniper position overlooking the compound, just like old times. Now, counts vary as to whether the FBI sniper shot anybody this time, but at this point, when you see really similar things happening, less than a year apart, you have to wonder why. It really seems like the ATF is desperate to prove their importance. They really seem to be on the lookout for a boogeyman, a really specific kind of politically correct white Christian domestic terror suspect who can prove that the ATF is really heroic and important and extremely necessary. And then there's always kind of this bait and switch going on too. The ATF's jurisdiction is, of course, firearms, but whenever they or Janet Reno talk about the urgency of this situation in Waco, it's always the danger of this religious person, the danger posed to the kids, but neither of those things are relevant to the weapon charges. It's not the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Explosives, Cults, Dogs, and Kids. This is not their responsibility, but they escalate these situations to where they have to go in there, guns blazing, and then they can't back down after losing that first gunfight. So obviously, it's just downhill from there. There is a major problem with these kinds of sieges or raids or even hostage scenarios. We've already talked about how the separation between the sides creates a huge amount of confusion, and the longer it goes, the less rational the people get, especially, if you're doing all this psychological warfare stuff, preventing people from sleeping. But the second problem is that by ratcheting the stakes up so high, you create an incredibly dangerous situation where almost everybody involved has a go button. Everybody with a gun has a go button. Everybody with a radio has a go button. Even the dogs or the balloon seller down the street has a go button. And of course, nobody has a stop button. So to unwind this kind of high tension siege peacefully is almost impossible. It did happen at Ruby Ridge. Too late, but it did not happen at Waco. The next time somebody hit the go button was when they punched holes in the Mount Carmel Center compound with 50 caliber machine guns and lobbed CS canisters in. Turns out that was the wrong stuff to use indoors, and also it was flammable. 80 people died, including 28 kids. For years, the FBI claimed that they had not used any pyrotechnic CS grenades, but in 1999, they finally admitted, in the face of overwhelming evidence, that they had. They still claim that the Branch Davidians started the fire, though. And as soon as the flames died down, they swooped in, pulled out the remains and some firearm evidence, and then pushed everything else into a pit. All the other debris from the crushed cars and the smashed buildings, all the evidence of an important criminal investigation was just bulldozed up and carted off. There would be no further investigation, just lightning fast cleanup. And that is when I come into the picture. This is my first experience with the ATF. In 1993, I was very young and I got to see some of this stuff firsthand. I've never talked about this story on camera before. I don't really know how to tell this story, and there's kind of not much to it. My dad was a freelance cameraman and a videographer, which at the time involved cameras that were, about 80 pounds, and I was too little at that time to help carry those things, but I could set up lights and I could run sound. I was roughly the same age and size as Sammy Weaver was, but I'd been doing stuff with my dad for a couple of years. When things at Waco started to fall apart, a documentary producer called my dad and asked him to start filming. So we jumped in the car, we drove down to Texas, and by the time we got there, it was all over. Everything had been bulldozed into the pit, but you could still smell it. You could still smell the smoke and a lot of things. They'd built a chain link fence around where the compound had used to be, but it was pretty easy to climb, and some of the folks that we were with found a bunch of interesting items inside and a bunch of interesting items further away, like 40mm shell casings from those pyrotechnic CS gas grenades that nobody was using. We also interviewed a number of the survivors, and they described what things were like living in the compound, what things were like when the media campaign started against them, how things started during the raid, and then a little bit about the siege. And I think that left a pretty deep impression on me. I don't remember everything because it was 30 years ago. But the other thing was I was actually very distracted at the time. I was focused on the VU meters and running the sound. I was listening to the interviewees, but I kept getting distracted by just this very ominous, foreboding feeling, this idea that something so terrible had happened, that the government had done this to its own people, kept kind of just taking my attention off what was actually being said. But there are a few things that I do remember with a lot of detail. There was a lady that we interviewed, and before and after she was on camera, she went to the phone. She was calling the hospital because her daughter was in surgery, and she was trying to figure out if the surgeons had managed to save any of her fingers. So there are a lot of things that do kind of stand out from that time. Today, people occasionally say to me, Isaac, you only talk about freedom and liberty and gun rights because you work at a gun company. But I think those people have it completely backwards. I think this stuff is incredibly important for us all to talk about. This story of a rogue agency is vital to understanding a lot of different things. But this is where we're going to stop episode 2. Episode 3 is going to have a whole bunch more Waco aftermath stuff, and a massive change in gun culture is right on the heels of it. I've been saying this is a 3-part series, but we do still have like 30 years of ATF history to cover just to get us up to today. And, well, who knows what could happen next week.